Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody, I'm back on deck. So how's everybody out there? Certainly the last 10 days for me have been a bit challenging. Got filled by a fairly nasty infection which put me straight on my back for quite a bit of time. So I've been thoroughly poked, prodded, medicated, etc., by my doctors and the hospital. But I'm definitely back on the mend. So, my energy levels are getting back. The infection is obviously under control. And in the last 2 days, I've been back at work. And so I've been looking forward to getting back in the chair and doing the next podcast. And before I get on with that, let me extend my very, very heartfelt thanks to Miranda, who sat in the chair facilitating an hour and a half podcast with Andrew Flores, DeVonna Prinzi and Kristin Ruggaber. And it was very interesting, and I hope all of you listened to the content of that because I certainly enjoyed it. And there were some fantastic points that came through about the whole notion of change and inspiring change and how we can look at it. So in that context, again, thank you very, very much. It was heartfelt that there was such a stand-in and such a solid discussion. So as you all know who've been listening to the podcast, we've been talking about turning points. And in my last podcast, I was talking about substance use and abuse, and technically speaking, we're with sort of substance use disorders. That's the sort of classification in the diagnostic manual that psychologists and psychiatrists often use. I want to expand that a little bit because I think it's a really important topic. And as I've expressed before, it is virtually impossible to look at creating solid, resilient mental health if we are embedded in behaviour like abusing substances in order to stay well. You can't do it. It's just not possible. So we really need to understand that because in our culture, substance use is widely spread throughout the community and unfortunately starting very, very, very early on in adolescence. In the 80s, I was working in drug and alcohol specifically, and by and large amongst teenagers, we were on average looking at 14, 15-year-olds, probably 15 to 16-year-olds being more seriously at risk. 14-year-olds were sometimes experimenting, but that in those days was, in my experience, and probably for a lot of people in the field, fairly rare. Now it's not so rare. Certainly experimenting with alcohol, in my view, has become a much earlier practice. And in of itself, that's fairly disturbing because, adolescence is about the time when we start to really, formulate our personality about who we are, about what we're about, and certainly looking at how we deal with the world, including our parents, our peers, teachers, and, people might say, oh, look, we all tried it, didn't do us any real harm. But I think that we need to take that into context, and we really need to understand how we need to look at this spectrum of behaviour. Okay? So today I really want to sort of take a look at the whole issue of turning points in addictions per se. So part of that is to look at defining addictions and to look at the sort of models that we've had in our culture about the causes of addiction and what maintains addictions. And then, depending on time, what I might then do is in the next session talk about, okay, let's nail down what are the turning points when we are looking at someone with a substance abuse disorder and what's really going to help. And I'm going to come at that from the perspective of being a friend, a family member, but also a professional. One of the things that I'm often surprised at is that within the health professional sphere, helping someone explore their substance use isn't necessarily done in depth when a lot of the indicators tell us that it should be. Okay, so that's the gist for today and for the next podcast. And I want you to think about it not just in terms of others, but also, in some way, am I too at risk? It doesn't mean that I'm there yet, but, do I need to keep a check on my behaviour? Do I need to think about what's happening for me emotionally? Okay? So all right, let's talk about what is this thing called addictions. And fundamentally, the definition that we tend to use in my profession is that, addiction is a biopsychosocial disorder. In other words, there are some biological components in it, there are some psychological components relevant to the persistent and compulsive use of a substance, and there's definitely social aspects to it as well. Okay? So when I talk about compulsive behaviour, essentially what I'm talking about is people who have extraordinarily hard time in checking their behaviour and not following through with it. Okay? And in part of it is also there's an obsessional component about it. I certainly see that with people who are abusing alcohol and also people who are abusing, say, for example, stimulants, cocaine and speed or ice, methamphetamine, where a large part of their time is often consumed thinking about it. Okay? Now, I'm going to get into more details in the next episode with that. Why is that particularly relevant? And my view is that it is really important to understand how these factors hang together, because it has a bearing on how we approach it, both as a professional but also as a family member. Or friend even, when I talk about the impact of substance use in our community, any one person who has a substance abuse disorder immediately has an impact on 4 other people. And that impact is by definition negative. And we can go into details later about what sort of impact we're talking about and also how that may manifest itself. But it's particularly important to understand those relationships. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what sort of models do we have, what sort of theories do we have about what actually underlies addictions. And there's quite a few, actually. It's one of those areas where we're not just relying on a particular one particular theory. We're talking about a few. Now, the interesting thing is I could take a little bit out of most of those theories and put it together and probably approximate something that's, fairly accurate. But I'm going to run through it a little bit, sort of almost from a historical perspective. So the first idea about addictions was that it was fundamentally a sin. Okay, so during the 18th and early 19th century, most addiction was viewed as a sin. Drug-dependent people were considered morally weak, and the addiction was seen as a character flaw. And there are elements that still permeate through our society today, where it's, not quite articulated in that way, but there's this implication that this might be, the problem. So, in the 18th and 19th century, what would happen is that people who subscribed to this model saw users as ripe for punishment. Things like whippings, beatings, stocks, fines, public ridicule. Those sort of things were relatively common. It's almost like we're going to shame them out of their behaviour, which is certainly quite disturbing when you think about it from lots of different angles. The other element was that there was a strong religious connection in this because of the connection to sin. People were often, subjected, for want of a better word, to all sorts of religious practices to help them, strengthen their character to come out of, this sinful life. How successful was any of that? Probably not very. One of the things that did happen was that jail sentences were another form of punishment in this context, and by the turn of the century, many more drug users were put into mental hospitals as the jails were already full. So incarceration, removing someone's, liberties became one way of trying to help them, for want of a better word, control their problem. So the next model that arose had some more compassionate ideas, and that was that it was a disease. And it assumes that the origin of the addiction lies within the person, him or herself. It's generally a medical viewpoint, and it's an illness. It's seen as an illness. And so the point of view that model takes is that addiction doesn't exist on a continuum. It's either there or it isn't. So it's a very binary perspective. The other aspect is that addicted people cannot, under any circumstances, control their intake of any given substance. And once they consume some of the substance, so having one drink, they're out of control, and they'll be overcome by irresistible cravings. And so the only way to control it is by complete abstinence and forevermore. It's also viewed that the disease of addiction is irreversible. It cannot be cured, and the only long-term treatment is abstinence. Now, with all of these models, especially the disease models, there's some advantages in that. One of the advantages was that addiction stopped being just a legal issue but became a health issue. It also began to allow some addicted people to understand their behaviour better. And, abstinence as a treatment approach certainly worked for some people. And because it's perceived to be an illness, the sort of shame element also was diminished. And so people were able to, to establish a better relationship with themselves on this. Okay? Now, there's a number of disadvantages, but the three most common disadvantages in the disease modelling it means that it takes away the responsibility from the user. It only offers one course of treatment, and it's unfortunately not really supported by a lot of evidence. We've got over 100 and something years worth of research that's been looking for the disease factor in addictions, and we just don't have significant evidence for that. So that brings us to the next model, which is essentially the psychodynamic model. And this theory originated with, guess who, Sigmund Freud, and is still used today as a way of treating people with drug problems. And essentially what it proposes is that, most of our addictions can be linked to problems in our childhood, and then how we cope and don't cope as adults. In other words, drug use or misuse can be an unconscious response to some of the difficulties individuals may have experienced in childhood. Now, one of the things that we do have a lot of evidence for is that people with addictions frequently have a strong history of childhood trauma. And so we often may talk about self-medicating or simply, in some instances, dulling the pain that lies at the heart of their personality or soul, whichever way you want to look at it. So, there's a number of people who, including myself, who take a very strong view that, in order to heal addictions, we need to look for the trauma. The other model is social learning model. And basically, it's in 1976, Russell introduced the idea that dependence is not only chemical, but it's also behavioural and social in nature. Okay, and that was a huge step forward in many respects, in addition to the psychodynamic model, because we're talking about learned behaviour, things from conditioning, modelling, thinking about the substance. There's a pleasurable aspect to a lot of substance abuse. Unfortunately, in the medium to long term, the pleasure diminishes and the pain increases. The social learning model also talks about dependence is a normal facet of human behaviour. It only becomes a problem when the individual experiences a number of negative consequences as a result of their behaviour, but they continue to do it anyway. I'd like to reframe some of that a little bit more. I won't go into it at this point in time. So let me move on to the next model, which is what we call the socio-cultural model. And this fundamentally is based on the idea that the type of society in which people live has an impact on their drug use. And I would say that that's not just relevant to people, but it certainly has been established that it's also very relevant to rats, in that there was a very neat little experiment done that showed that if you put rats into an impoverished environment, they will bar press for cocaine until they drop dead. If you put the rats into what's called rat heaven, in other words, there's lots of stuff for them to entertain themselves with, great food, great variety of, interactions with other rats, they tend not to do that. And so that, to me, makes a lot of sense. And it's also, it lacks a certain, that moralism that often creeps into this idea of, addictions where it's a weakness of character and, only the poor do this sort of thing, which is quite an objectionable perspective. In Australia, we took a public health model, and that approach is basically about harm minimisation, and it's, we have 3 levels of prevention that occur within this model. The first one is primary. In other words, we develop the community, we educate, and we have media-based strategies. The secondary prevention level is that the problem's identified in its very early stages and intervention is applied to stop further progress of any sort of possible problematic drug use. And the tertiary level is when the problem is perceived to be serious and may be affecting the individual's health, finances, relationships, legal status, and treatment usually is about rehabilitation. In fact, let me be more specific. It may require detox, it may require rehab, it will require counselling, and so on. So fundamentally, they're the sort of key models that we're talking about in addictions. And, as the chronology shows, we've become less moralistic, at least within professional circles and some of the more enlightened areas in our community, and we have started to look at what are the key factors that involve to maintain this problem behaviour, and how can we effectively treat it? One of the unfortunate things in treating addictions is that relapse is often a very significant part of a person's healing journey, and we need to be cognizant of that. The expectation that, once you've identified the problem, you go into hospital, you go through rehab, you come out and all's good forevermore, just doesn't apply. It's just not how it works. So again, let me come back to specifying addiction. It's the biopsychosocial perspective on the persistent compulsive and obsessional use of a substance, wherein, and I'm going to add this in now, wherein there may be a level of physical tolerance and dependency. In other words, if you don't use, you go into withdrawal, and then the rest of it is very much the psychosocial aspect to it. Okay. Now, in the next podcast, what I want to focus on is, okay, so how do we get out of this? If, either as a person who may sort of go, oh, maybe I am addicted, what is it that I need to do? What's the turning point necessary? And I'll talk a little bit about that. And I want to also talk about how we can facilitate rather than enable a person, to deal with their problem. And when I talk about enabling, I'm talking about the person maintaining their addiction or their substance abuse disorder. We often do things that are meant to help but actually maintain the problem. It doesn't actually address it. And so, that becomes an important aspect in when we sort of think about this. And in many respects, this is, how to get the monkey off my back. Because, the turning point beyond that is, how do I maintain, what are the factors required for me to maintain my well-being, my resilience, my capacity to live without my addiction, as it were. So I hope you found this useful, and I certainly look forward for all of you to join me in the next session to get some more thoughts about this, because in our culture we really do need to understand what it is we're doing with these substances, because they may be okay in very, very small doses, and we may get away with a lot of stuff in very small doses, but the more we use, the bigger the problem gets. Until next time, I'll speak to you soon. And look forward to everybody joining me for another interesting session on Inspiring Change.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.